for a keynote on this very crucial subject on public-private cooperation for data sharing. The Parliamentary State Secretary of the German Transportation Ministry. Very delighted to welcome her here in Leipzig and hear from her, ladies and gentlemen, State Secretary Dorothee Bär.
Geht das Mikro jetzt? Jawohl.
Well, does the microphone work? Yes. I absolutely understand those who are currently having lunch, which is very important to me too. But still, I hope that all those who are here to listen are not hungry. Should that be the case, it would not be a problem to have your lunch while you listen to the keynote. Ladies and gentlemen, participants of the International Transport Forum, the decisive question for the ministry is, how did you get here? I'm not going to make a survey, but did you travel here by car? Did you use our ITF shuttle? Did you use public transport to get here? Maybe you used your app to look for the fastest solution to get here from the main train station. No matter how you got here, hardly anybody will have arrived here by walking, and hardly anybody will have arrived here without smartphone. You will have consumed a lot of data. You will have produced a lot of data on the way. You will have probably looked for information on the weather, on routes to get here, and all that. Those who came here by plane, everybody has consumed and provided data in some way or other. You might have disclosed your position by making search engine searches, and all that would have been recorded by your smartphones. Is that something that you're scared of, that you're afraid of? Am I afraid of it? I can say no. For me, it's very important to understand this data not only as a monster, but rather as a treasure of data, a treasure that can lead to great and useful things that make our life more convenient. I think the title of my ministry should also be a ministry that makes life easier, because a lot of those things that we do and that we are in charge of would make life uncomplicated and easier. And it's incredible to see what is being facilitated by this data treasure. And we're going to take a look at various examples of that today. But still, data are not being used enough by us. We need an entirely different data culture. It has been said very often that we need to be economical with our data, which is nonsense. We need an entirely new type of data culture. Germany, a host country for the IDF, we are, according to a study of the European Commission, we are not world champion, we're not market leader, but we are just average. That's a bad word, and we'd like to change that position. We don't want to be average. Therefore, the question for us is not which data are we allowed to disclose and to release, but the question should rather be, why are there data that we do not release, that we don't use? We needed to get away from an economical approach towards data, but rather making use of it. All ministries and the downstream authorities have an enormous wealth of data, and we have come to understand the significance of that data for the entire society. And probably we were the only ministry to understand that. And that is why in December 2016 we acceded to the International Open Data Partnership. And together with 74 other countries, we are engaging and committing ourselves for more activities in this field. In the cabinet, we passed an open data law. The draft legislation foresees the obligation of public authorities to provide their data to society. The willingness, indeed, could be a little bit larger and stronger. Many authorities invoke safety aspects. I don't want to diminish them, no way. But not all data which is being labeled as being data relevant, of such a nature that they could never be released. That probably won't be the case. Now, in all of our considerations, we also said that data security and data safety must be considered too. Our society expects high data security standards, and for autonomous driving, for connected driving, we need a lot of data too, which means that we also have to put safety standards in place. But still, risks are important. We need to take care of them. They are important to be taken care of, but that is a topic that everybody is focusing on. And very often people tend to focus exclusively on risk, which is why we want to take a look at the potential for usage. One of the central opportunities of open data is to take on board innovative startup companies. We want to provide tailored solutions for tomorrow's road network. In the field of transport, we're going to see changes occurring. We'll see them in the very appearance of roads to an extent that we haven't witnessed over the last 100 years, and that's going to take place within a very short period of time. We want to facilitate new business models, which is why we put up a support program for innovation in the field of mobile or rather in the field of mobility. Probably mobility is not the most important topic for most people, but it is the second most important topic for people, superseded only by health. Mobility is something that moves us every day in both directions. With this N Fund, we're going to provide 100 million euros over the next couple of years. We support a diversity of various projects, from the initial ideas down to the application. We are one of those who say that startups and an idea is allowed to make money with that. The purpose is to provide money not only, well, for startups in order to have supported something, but these business models, at the end of the day, are allowed to make money. And you will get to know one of the brains behind such ideas. I'd like to welcome Maxim Rudi, who is here with us. Very happy to have you with us, and I'm very glad about your cooperation with us in the ministry, and happy for your willingness to share your ideas with us later on. Warm welcome. I just wanted to provoke an applause, but probably this didn't work out too well. I didn't want him to ask to the stage, but that's the typical difference between men and women. Men storm the stage. Warm welcome. We're in charge not only of financial support, but there are other types of events that we host at our ministry. We want to get actors from the field of politics, economy, and research. We want to bring these people together and connect them. Startups with their innovative solutions should be able to profit from our M Fund. In addition to our M Fund, we've got an M Cloud, which is an access point for data from our ministry and from data providers from the private sphere. The goal here is to make as much data available to private users as possible. Limits to access to data is something that we want to diminish and abolish. We want to create organizational structure for an open access to data. It's not that easy as it sounds like, not only with regard to the cooperation with authorities, but also with regard to private providers. Encourage them to share their data. So we've got M Fund, financial support, and the network of experts, which is unique in the German landscape. It's important for us that we understand together, not only in Germany, but also in Europe and even beyond that on a global level, that we understand that the open data topic is becoming increasingly important, that we all win if we share data and don't keep it all to ourselves. Authorities, ministries, and societies should pull in the same direction. They should work together, demonstrating that by way of open data, innovative business models can emerge. Everybody's been saying that data is the raw material of the future, but so far we've been pretty tight-fisted with that raw material. It's something that we want to change too. Now, if we bring together all that data, then we indeed can propel revolutionary developments in the field of transport that we'd like to take part in. And I hope you also would like to take part in that development. And I wish you a lot of interesting debates here in Leipzig and hope that you all return to us. But now I'm looking forward to the discussion here on stage, and I wish you a couple of nice days in Leipzig at the ADF, and we're going to see at various occasions in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your words. Now, I've been told that I will be asking you questions in English. It's obviously we have translators on hand, so feel free to answer in German if you like. And welcome also from my side to Maxim Nouroudi, the CEO and co-founder of Door to Door company based in Berlin with approximately 100 employees. Now, based on picking up on your keynotes, Ms. State Secretary, your ministry is the only ministry that actually has open data in its official title. Perhaps, and you alluded to it throughout your conversation, but throughout your keynote, but perhaps you can stress the importance for your ministry.
Ja, das mache ich sehr gerne.
Yes, I will be happy to do that. Open data was an important topic for me even before I joined the ministry, even as a student, because I was of the opinion that with the research that was being done in the university, that all of that is data, is insight that has been paid for by the taxpayers. So why should it not be accessible for everyone? And in our ministry, we have so many other authorities and bodies downstream. If you've read publications from our ministries in the past years, we didn't focus on this topic, unfortunately, but rather on less important topics like infrastructure levies that caused more media attention than a topic that you've probably also mentioned today. We are also responsible of the German weather reports, and you've probably all talked about the weather today. And weather data is really interesting, not only for the conversation when you don't want to talk about politics, but it's also interesting because there are projects like the one in cooperation with companies, with academia that we have that allows us to forecast precisely on which day at which highway there will be ice on the road or not. So you can now say whether that is decisive and whether this can help save money. And I can say, yes, we can. Because, for example, in the procurement of salt for the roads, you can actually target this procurement very precisely, which allows you to save costs and also allows you to make the roads safer and also allows you to save costs in terms of preserving the roads because they can be destroyed by the salt that is used on them. We also have the Federal Authority for Maritime Transport and Hydrography. There we had a startup with a hackathon that researched the jellyfish movement in the North Sea to find out certain insights, and also the Federal Road Authority. We have so many interesting authorities that generate data, and we want to create something new from this data and create new business models from that.
Developed on a daily basis, and one of them obviously is Door to Door. Maxim, for those in the audience who are not familiar with the work of Door to Door, perhaps you can give us a brief oversight about a brief history, why it was founded and what purpose it serves.
Oh, sure, thank you. So, this one works too. Achso, ich muss auf Deutsch jetzt antworten.
I'll be speaking in German. We started in 2012 with the idea that at the end we would want to introduce public transport that is as comfortable as driving your own car, based on data, based on ride-sharing services that could be used like a B2B Uber service. And in 2012, we bet that cities and transport companies would not want to rely on third-party platforms like Uber and others, who would then take care of the public transport business, but rather that they wanted to be autonomous and independent and have their own autonomous platforms. And that is how we set up the company. We wanted to create a platform for on-demand mobility for transport companies, for cities, to allow them to use the new mobility solutions and introduce them themselves. And the important first part of that was to analyze the demand and offer of mobility, because we have to know in our city which mode of transport is available to go from A to B, where do we have more demand than offers. That is where we have to start. And through the smartphone data that we have available today, data that is, for example, provided by INRIX about where cars are actually driving, and also using data from the cell phone stations, and also through data regarding the offer, that is to say, what public transport goes from A to B. So with this mixture of data, we want to make a statement, we want to have a result. So if you want to make a cake, you don't just need flour, you also need salt, sugar, etc. So we're using these different kinds of data to say, for example, here in Leipzig, where we can improve public transport. And for that, one ingredient to do that is the question, where does public transport actually run in Leipzig? So what types of public transport are available? And we're not only talking about personalized data here, we're talking very trivial about the public transport bus schedules, digitized schedules. So that is one necessary ingredient for our business model, to carry out analytics of this type of mobility, to introduce new services for mobility based on that, right where they are needed. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
It's essential to the work of door-to-door and the success of door-to-door, obviously. Now, your ministry, Ms. Beer, is funding digital database applications, I think since 2016, with a research initiative called mFunds. For those in the audience who might not be familiar with mFunds, what is it, and what is it supposed to do?
Well, we have a combination in the mFund, where we provide funding of 100 million euros to better promote innovative solutions, because we say that the ministry cannot do everything themselves, but rather we need the bright minds to support us and tell us where transport can be improved. For example, Mr. Nohrudi said they need the bus schedules. So we wonder whether we can improve public transport in a way that bus schedules become obsolete, because mobility is always available. So it would be great for everyone to know that when they leave the house, after a couple of minutes, they will have a connection. Because people are no longer buying mobility, not even a certain mode of transport. That is to say, they're not buying a car nor a bus or an e-bike, but what they're buying is time. And that is, they want to buy time that they can save on mobility. So research in this field is very important, and that is why we invited startups to come to the ministry. We did that twice now. The first round was the startup pitch, and the second time will take place in August in our ministry. So we had a hackathon where we invited 80 hackers to the ministry. We provided our data and said, okay, go ahead and let's see where that takes us. We have been looked at quite suspiciously whether it would be great to allow hackers to come to a federal ministry. Well, the worst thing that happened was that our Erich Klausner Saal was soiled a bit with soft drinks, and nothing else happened really. And we really want to build on that, because the data is aware, it is there, it's not being used, nobody is using it, and that is a waste of macroeconomic resources in a way.
Perhaps you, Maxim, can tell us how your company, how Door-to-Door, has benefited from mFund.
Gerne. Also erstmal möchte ich
Well, first of all, I would like to start by saying that what the Federal Ministry for Transport and Digital Infrastructure has done is unique in comparison to other federal ministries and also to other state ministries. So having a hackathon to communicate to the inside of the ministry, to the authorities like the Maritime Transport Authority, we have great data available. So let's go ahead and see what new ideas and business models can be developed from that. So that was really evolutionary. Not even the Interior Ministry did that, nor the Ministry for Economy. So you just said it. There also was resistance to be overcome. Suddenly, software developers come along and they might just break down the Wi-Fi connection in the federal ministry, or other things. But what we saw is that they came up with great ideas. And we also noticed in the downstream authorities what treasures they were hoarding, and they were not even aware of that. That also promotes confidence. So packaging that with the startup pitches that are taking place now, that are the next step of this initiative, as a whole concept, as a whole idea for policymakers, is a great approach. And I've said it before, I'd be happy if every city council, every ministry used this type of mechanisms to tap into their data treasure. So now, to be more specific, we applied for mFund as well. We underwent a very strict procedure because weather data is relevant for us. People move differently when it rains, when it snows, when the sun is out. So that's the type of data that we want to have on our platform. And we also want to have statistical data on where people live, how old they are. And all this data is available in the mCloud. So the overall concept of saying that we have a cloud with the data, and we also provide some funding for ideas to use this data to actually allow these ideas to go the first step. That is a great idea. And if you'd allow me to add that, the investment scene in Europe is very young when it comes to mobility. They are an e-commerce characterized ecosystem. The investors invest in shipping shoes via the internet or pizza or whatever. But this type of business model that change mobility, that is new. So that requires the leverage provided by the ministry with their mFund.
Touched upon the importance of cooperation between the public and private sectors in the field of data-related innovations. Ms. Baer, perhaps you can stress why it's so relevant. Why is it so essential that the cooperation between public and private sectors here are in place?
For us, it's important to take the expertise on board because in the ministry, we don't really have many hackers employed, even though we have thousands of officials there who can tell us precisely what to do with the data. And Mr. Nouroudi is right when he says also in the downstream authorities, our employees are noticing that what they're working on a daily basis is even more relevant than they realize. And there are also private providers who have data. For example, a platform like Door2Door can also provide data for us, traffic data, for example. On a state level or municipality level, we don't have access to that. Germany is a federal state, so we don't just only have the 16 states, but rather, so far, we had the 16 states who cooperated, and in Bavaria, I noticed how difficult it was to even cross state borders and to manage to have a joint network that allows a city bus to go into rural areas or even into neighboring counties. So it's very difficult to have comprehensive information about that. And in an ideal case, and that's what people expect, is that the providers tell you that for example, your alarm clock goes off at the right time according to the weather situation, traffic situation, and then you will know how far you'll have to walk to the next bus stop, for example. Last night, for example, in Berlin, we had a huge thunderstorm for half an hour, and that is precisely the time where you have a different usage of the traffic and transport network. But we don't have data on that. We only have the federal data that we can access, and that is where we need connectivity. And my hope is for the next years to have a more comprehensive coverage of this data. We're doing that in the big cities, that's also important, but we also have to take the rural areas on board. And the people who are here on this forum are not only from the capital cities either. So for the future of mobilities, it's important to cover those areas where we don't have a lot of public transport or where there will never be a subway train. That doesn't only apply to Germany, that also applies to the suburbs of Paris, for example, in the rural regions in France or in Italy. there you need to find solutions through these new applications that make life easier if you don't live in the metropolitan areas of this world.
To wrap up this portion of the panel, perhaps you can, from your own practice, share with us a best case scenario or example of a cooperation between the public and private sector.
Naja, wir haben ja schon sehr gute.
We already have a great example here where a federal ministry goes ahead and says, okay, let's tap into our data treasure. And this is a framework, as I've already said, that others should copy. We are dealing with other transport companies who progressively and innovatively say, let's open up our data treasure. We're talking about the bus schedule here. Just let me get back to that. We're not talking about rocket science. You can just go to the bus stop and take a look at the schedule. So there's a huge excitement about that. In 2012, when we started, the entire Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, had their public transport data digitized and provided in a standardized way on a platform for free, because the state says if new business models can arise from that, these companies will be paying corporate tax, value-added tax, etc. So we'll make our money with that. And we have the interesting situation that some transport companies say they want to have money for digitizing their schedules. So, well, I'd be willing to pay a couple of cents for that, but from a point of view of the mindset, there's a lack of openness, of progressivity to say, okay, let's provide the data online. Ms. Baer just said that some of the public transport unions are a bit reluctant to do that, and that may be one of the reasons for why we are still average and not market leaders in Germany. And I would be happy to see more progressiveness when it comes to providing data.
Because it will give a nice segue to the international voices, since we've heard from the two German speakers. Yes, in Germany we do have the never-ending debates about the need for privacy versus the benefits of data. Perhaps shortly, the question to the both of you before we wrap this up. Do you think this will change anytime soon? I mean, if we see the attitude in the US, for instance, or other countries, it's a bit different, no? In Germany, do you foresee any changes in the imminent future?
Also wir sind ein bisschen
We are driven by fear, unfortunately, but I think things can change if we get real and explain the added value of data to people in real terms. So what's decisive is that we don't say in X years all cars will be driving autonomously, but we're not providing use cases. We don't tell the 80-year-old lady what her benefit will be of that, or a 30-year-old mom, for example. Everything is left on a meta level, and if all in all we manage as politicians, as journalists, as members of society, to tell people this is your benefit of that. Perhaps in the past not everybody was enthusiastic about the washing machine because they were afraid of what would happen if it leaked, for example. But if you explain to a mother in the 50s that they didn't have to potty train their children at 1 year because they had to wash all the nappies by hand, or when Pampers was introduced, that's a very real example. Suddenly people noticed the benefits for their life, and the same goes for individual transport. When cars were invented, when planes were invented, people were afraid of speed when the railway was invented, the speed causing brain tumors. So it's all about making life easier. You want people to have a better life than they used to have, and that is an aspect that is missing from the public debate. And even if the parents don't have to tell their children that their life will be better, but we as a society have to tell the later generations that we want to have them a better life without congestion, etc. So in brief, we need to make people enthusiastic and get over the skepticism.
Well, I believe that throughout the last 18 months, a lot of things have happened. Things have picked up speed extremely, and municipalities, rural areas came to understand that there is a lot of potential stemming from digitization. We're going to have a press conference on on-demand public transport in rural areas. And the engine, well, the mother there in rural areas is basically a taxi driver. She picks up kids at school after having brought them there in the first place and then distributes them to various activities. That was not the idea of such a mother in a rural area, to be a taxi driver. So we need a new mobility concept there. We would provide the platform for such a system. And if we do that, we would achieve progress. And that is important to understand. And this is being increasingly understood by citizens and managing directors of transport companies.
In Germany, and the willingness to open up and be more bold when it comes to data. This wraps up, if you will, the German perspective on the subject matter. We'll do a quick segue, but not before we thank the State Secretary Dorothee Bär and Maxim Nouroudi for their contribution. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to welcome three panelists on stage who, if you will broaden the discussion and give us a more international sense after we've talked about the German perspective. Very happy to welcome amidst us Laura Schuel, who is the CEO of Streetlight Data, which uses big data to analyze travel patterns. More about that in just a moment. Laura can speak in more detail about what it entails. Very happy to welcome the Vice President of Global Communications of MOVEit's public transit app and mapping service, Steve Swayze. And last but not least, also welcome to Scott Sedlick, the General Manager and Vice President of INRIX, an app to simplify one's commute using real-time traffic alerts and navigation. Now, before we get into a Q&A, not just amongst ourselves, but also take in some questions, I understand that there'll be short presentations. And why don't we start off, Laura, with you? Very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you all for having us, and thanks for getting the American pronunciation, not the German pronunciation of my last name. Very impressive. So I'm from Streetlight Data. We are a Silicon Valley tech startup based in California. We are about 4 years old, have 25 employees, and we are the people who will help you take the treasure of data that the Secretary referred to and actually make it useful for transportation applications. So as we all know, there's a lot of data out there. There's data coming off almost everything there that moves. It's coming out of your car, it's coming out of trucks, it's coming off containers, it's coming off in droves off these mobile phones, it's coming out of the stoplights, it's coming out of the roadways. Everywhere we look, there's data being produced. And what we want so much in this community is to take that data and actually use it to help us transform transportation into something that is better than what we have today. So what Streetlight does is provide a tool to make that data useful. We procure data from a variety of different mobile devices, some from INRIX, as Scott will tell you about, some from a constellation of about 400 different mobile apps that send us huge amounts of data about mobility flows, and we mix that data from the private sector with data from the public sector, data that describes roads and rights of way and land use and parcel designations and points of interest. And we turn all that data into a tool that will answer questions that you actually care about. So we call that the difference between data and analytics, and that's something I want to get into in our discussion. So let me give you an example. Say you had a traffic jam outside of a major city. I'll take an example. We've done several hundred of these projects, but let's take Washington, D.C. If you've ever been there, traffic is awful. The DC and metro area, they want to put in a new bus route. They want to put in some new shuttle services. In the old world, you might wait to see which constituents suggested a bus route. You might do a survey that takes many, many months and no one responds. You might just assume that you know where the most congestion is. Maybe it's on the biggest part of the highway and try to put your new shuttle service there. That is a very old-fashioned way to make a very expensive decision that will probably last for 20 years. Instead, this is what we do with data. First, we scan every single segment of road in the entire area, and we identify the hotspots. And we define a hotspot as a place that has a lot of congestion, very slow traffic, and that has characteristics that are good for transit. So for example, we might want to make a hotspot a road segment that's congested and has a lot of cars driving under 3 miles. That's low-hanging fruit for something like a shuttle or a bike lane. We might want to scan all the roads and find the roads where people are driving in cars, but they all share the same origin and destination. In this way, we can optimize where we pay attention to. We can optimize where we place our new transit systems instead of just guessing and hope that that decision is good. So it's a very quick example of going from data to analytics. We can get all the data we need from smartphones, but to actually put it to use, we have to provide those analytics that diagnose a problem and suggest a solution. So our platform allows that analytics at your fingertips. You can quickly zoom in on a map, double click, and get back all the information you might desire about who's on the road, where they're going, what are their demographics, travel time, etc. We think our mission is to first and foremost save transportation ministries time so that they can actually do the work of interesting policy analysis, not spend all their time wrangling data, to use better data, and to make better decisions that in the long run save carbon and save a lot of money. So when we talk about public and private partnerships, there are 3 core beliefs that I wanted to share with you before we get into the discussion. First, I think we need tools that are flexible to ingest different types of data because the mobility data out there is changing rapidly. So for example, we recently stopped using all data from cellular towers, which I've heard mentioned several times in this conference. Cellular tower data, very spatially imprecise, lots of technical issues. Instead, we're using data that comes off the phones themselves, the apps. That transition was very easy for us, but I see some countries and some groups and some companies that spent so much money fixating on this one source of data that they're going to have trouble flexing to the bigger and better and more evolutionary thing. So finding tools that can flex and surf the wave of data as it changes is important. Next, there's a difference between data and analytics. I see a lot of agencies procuring a lot of data, and then it just sits somewhere and they don't know what to do with it. And the German secretary gave some great examples of that. We need to not just have data, we need to analyze it and create solutions from it. If all you have at the end of your project is a pretty map, it's probably a good sign that you didn't do a good job with your analytics. You just visualized a bunch of data. And my third point is that data is valuable. And so that means somebody needs to pay for it. And I see still this habit of thinking that because it's digital, because it's software, it's not as valuable as a physical sensor, as a physical hardware. And that's simply not true. And the data needs to be valued appropriately. Because if it's not valued and if someone doesn't pay for it, then startups like me won't exist to innovate and create new things. And the other concern is that if it's not paid for by someone who has the public interest at heart, say if it's only paid for by the advertising industry, then whoever pays for it is going to be the ultimate arbiter of its purpose. So if we have too much reliance on advertising and marketing as the source of our data and not from the public sector, we risk data that's not in fact for the public good. So I look forward to hearing from everyone else into the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you to Laura for these initial remarks. And without losing time, Scott, why don't you take it from here?
Great, thank you very much. So INRIX sits at the intersection of the connected car and smart cities and national federal transportation agencies. We're a 12-year-old company with over 400 people, and we're powering traffic information for companies like BMW, Audi, Volkswagen, Ford, Toyota. Many of the automotive companies are integrating our real-time data into their platforms to help drivers find parking spaces that are available and to avoid traffic congestion. But we also work with over 400 departments of transport in 50 countries in supplying data and analytics, like Laura was describing, to help them build transport models as well as do real-time operations and other planning efforts. I wanted to briefly talk about a theme that I call the crowd, the cloud, and big data, which are really transforming the roles and opportunities for collaboration between the private sector and public sector departments of transports and cities. We're experiencing amazing momentum today with technology innovations that are helping transport agencies plan and manage mobility and that also provide tools and information to the public. What would have taken 3 to 5 years to deploy several years ago can now be implemented in less than 6 months. In fact, the RFP and tender processes on many intelligent transportation systems tenders are now often taking longer than the time to execute the projects. So I'd like to quickly provide a couple examples of the crowd, the cloud, and big data that highlight these changes as they relate to mobility. First, the crowd. So we are in an unprecedented time with a sheer amount of anonymous information available related to traffic information, origin and destination information, or we also call trips, parking patterns and occupancy, and transit data. For example, the United States Department of Transport has just licensed INRIX's historical traffic information for the entire U.S. strategic road network. That's over 220,000 centerline miles of roadways for the next 5 years. They'll be using this data to provide to states, metropolitan planning agencies, and cities so that they can comply with a new federal rule that has been enacted in just the past month for reporting on congestion trends, setting performance targets, and defining initiatives to help plan their budgeting efforts as it relates to traffic congestion and the overall effectiveness of the system. So in this case, the federal ministry is actually funding an effort to provide data to states and cities, and then so the states and cities can report against how the federal matching funds are being used on these projects. This data is being collected from the crowd. It's anonymously from hundreds of millions of connected cars, commercial vehicles, and GPS-enabled devices. INRIX, for example, has over 350 million devices that we're collecting information anonymously from every day. Some of these devices are reporting every second. Other devices are reporting every 15 seconds or 30 seconds or maybe every 1 minute. So that results in INRIX processing petabytes of this mobility information every single day. It's an incredible amount of data that continues to grow. Highways England is another example, using INRIX crowd-based data to manage their strategic network for their over 8,000 miles of roadways. The city of Copenhagen is now looking at, is implementing, using real-time traffic information to help manage corridors, to manage the street lights dynamically so that cars on certain corridors can have green lights all the way through. In terms of the cloud, I wanted to talk about a shift that we're seeing in three specific areas by departments of transport. First, they're shifting from massive investments in the purchase and maintenance of physical sensor infrastructure for roadways toward a hybrid approach of using their existing sensor network that are in and alongside the roads, along with data collected from private companies, and fusing that information to provide back out for their own planning and operational efforts. The Danish Road Directorate is a recent example. They just licensed our GPS data to provide information across 30,000 kilometers, essentially the entire roadway network within Denmark, because it's too expensive to manage and monitor physical sensors across that entire network. The second shift that we're seeing is DOT is creating new policies and procedures to use public and private clouds for data information and data processing. They're saving a lot of money, as well as having much more flexibility rather than requiring everything to be within their own infrastructure. It allows them to innovate much faster. And finally, I wanted to caution transport ministries on overspending on vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure technologies. We're seeing technologies move so quickly that things like 5G and other technologies are basically creating new mechanisms that replace the functionality of vehicle-to-vehicle and many of the use cases for vehicle-to-infrastructure. And again, we see a kind of hybrid approach in implementing those technologies, vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure on key corridors, but using other data and virtual sensors on the rest of the network. Finally, just 1 minute on big data. So as Laura mentioned, big data it's not really about the data itself. Just because there's a lot of data doesn't mean it's big. And it's often residing within silos within many of your agencies. Big data is really about intelligently combining that information and then using analytical tools to be able to process and understand that information. Analytics is critical, and that's where agencies should be investing both in the technologies but also in the people, and in terms of recruiting, hiring the right people that can use that information for their planning. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, for giving us an overview of INRIX's work. And last but not least, happy to hear from Steve Swayze and MOVEit.
Thank you. Our words are important. Already we've heard some very important words from the Secretary this morning, this afternoon, about $100 million going to the M Fund. Excited about that. I really like what Laura said about data alone is not important enough if you don't analyze it. So our words are important. So I've got a few words about MOVEit, but I also brought some pictures. So if we can look at the screen, we can all agree that gridlock, whether it is on our city streets and highways or whether it's in our transit, gridlock and stopped mobility is not desirable and it is not sustainable. And so we have this conference and many other conferences and hundreds of thousands of hours of work by people like yourselves and us that are trying to resolve this. I'm with MOVEit. MOVEit, if you don't know, is the world's #1 transit app. We've got more than 60 million users using it on iOS and Android devices in more than 1,300 cities in 78 countries in 43 languages around the world. Just really quickly, who here has heard of MOVEit? Please let me know. Oh, good, thank you. Those of you who haven't heard it, please download it now. Those of you who have, please tell a friend. We make getting from point A to point B very easy. And because MOVEit has this unsurpassed transit app, MOVEit has gathered, collected, and owns and operates the world's largest and only repository of transit data that we are now able to license to municipalities and transit agencies and authorities. So how we take a look at the future of urban mobility at MOVEit is through the lens of what we call the urban mobility stack. And before I get into that, I'd like to introduce Leon Rizzi, our vice president. He's right there in the center. If you haven't met him, you should. He's also with me today to talk about this future of urban mobility. So let's think about the future of urban mobility. We look at it as a stack of 4 levels. At the base level is the infrastructure level, which is roads and bridges and tunnels and garages, parking structures, that which cities and communities and countries have built over decades and which is pretty immovable. The urban mobility stack starts with the infrastructure layer. The next layer is the data and rules layer, which is the speed limits and the permits and the licenses, everything that municipalities and transit authorities and civic governments rule and provide. The next layer is the vehicles layer, which of course is cars and buses and trains and bicycles, how we get around what we get into to go from our homes to our work to the store to pick up our children at school. The vehicles layer. The top layer is the user interface layer. And we believe that this has fundamentally changed already. We've already talked about it here. We'll talk about it more in the question and answer. The user interface layer has changed how people consume mobility. Through your smartphone with apps like MOVEit or Uber or Chariot or innumerable other apps, you have changed. The revolution has started in terms of urban mobility. The next layer of the revolution will go down to the vehicles layer. We're already seeing the urban mobility change with autonomous vehicles. There's a Mercedes downstairs that's the delivery vehicle of the future. The urban mobility revolution will change when the vehicle layers change as well. We believe that the data and rule layer is going to be the one that rules them all. And I think that's a good segue to start our conversation.
Right, thank you so much, Steve. And I do want to get the audience involved soon, but I want to pick up on what our German panelists said, namely the need to strike a balance between the public benefit of data and privacy. Obviously, you've noticed this is a topic that is very passionately and emotionally discussed in Germany. Now, obviously, based in the United States, it's a different tune, it's a different attitude, perhaps. Can you share with us how this topic is being discussed on the other side of the Atlantic, and perhaps what words of advice you would have to somewhat cautious German public?
Sure. So I can start and then feel free to jump in. So the United States does not care as much about privacy from a regulatory perspective as Germany does, which is no shock to anyone. I think that in the United States we see, and in Canada it's a little different, so I'll speak predominantly about the United States. In the United States we see a broad acceptance of allowing private companies access to even very private, personally identifiable information, individualized pieces of data. But we also see a distrust in letting the public sector access that data. So one of the key value propositions we find for intermediary companies, like a lot of the ones up here, is providing a privacy function, where we can allow parts of the government or of the industries access to the insights from data without getting their hands on the raw stuff. And that's a very important thing to do in terms of developing trust amongst your different constituencies. So in terms of thinking in Europe, and I know that public perceptions of private versus public handling of data are altered here, finding trusted third parties and paying very close attention to what they do is a very efficient way to regulate the flow of private information. I also think that as we see a diversity of data supply, especially data supply that moves away from these big centralized telcos to the smaller apps, attention needs to be paid pretty swiftly because it's moving faster than I see the American regulators or the European regulators keep up with it.
Scott?
Yeah, several comments to add to what Laura was describing. Ultimately, there's a balance between privacy and the sharing of that information for various use cases. INRIX pays the highest attention to privacy in the 50 countries that we operate around the world. In some of those countries, such as in China or UAE or Saudi Arabia, for example, location information can actually leave the country. And so it's not just the privacy of the information, but also where that data is processed and local clouds and delivered back within the countries themselves and stuff. In terms of the innovation and recommendations for transport agencies and policy, again, it's kind of understanding the use cases and striking that right balance. As we look at this value chain from the data actually coming from connected cars, from freight vehicles, from taxis, from smartphones, the location information and other information, or the user identifiable information is cut off after it's collected by an intermediary, such as the app developer or another company in the middle. And then that information is often provided to the next layer of company that's like an INRIX that's collecting that data from thousands of sources, aggregating that and further anonymizing it, processing it for traffic information, processing it for anonymous trip information and that kind of thing. And so I think the recommendation is really just to understand the use cases and to find that right balance.
Steve?
Real quickly on this, because I agree with all of this, but I think what it comes down to is consumers' trust. Do you trust the organization that you're putting on your phone, the app you're downloading? And we need to ensure that we're always providing the highest level of trust among consumers for what we're providing the data. MoveIt's data is anonymous. We don't know if you're a male or female. We just know you're getting on the bus and getting off. The key thing that, and I think State Secretary Barr said it this morning very well, that when she mentioned the diapers issue, when you get the mass consumer to understand something and appreciate it, then you're golden. So we need all of us to ensure that we're always acting in the best trust of the consumer.
Time runs fast. We have approximately 15 minutes left in this discussion, which is why I want to make use of the expertise in the audience and take some questions and comments that you might have brought up by the German participants, but of course also what was just being discussed. I think we have microphones in the room, so if you have a question or a comment, yes, go ahead, please, and please introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Herman Lleras. I work with Steer Davis Cliff, a consultancy that use your data. One issue that we faced regularly, for instance, with commercial banking financing infrastructure, is we forecast traffic based in a lot of your data. And some of those institutions require some level of trust, not in the sense that you were mentioning, but in terms of producing reliance letters and legal documentation supporting where do we get the data. And I always lack that level of legal complexity. I understand the world is not ready for all these changes yet. Have you any comment on where do you see this going in terms of your organization saying things a bit more in the legal way that we can then use for the lawyers?
Yeah, I would suggest that INRIX has several thousand sources of providers providing us data across these 50 countries, and so we're happy to provide a certain level of information, but we typically do not release the names contractually of the individual companies. But in specific cases, we can talk about what level of information we can provide. We understand there's complexity, and we want to encourage the rollout of these innovations, so we're usually pretty flexible.
Great question. So we've heard your concern several times from different clients, and thanks to Steer Davis for being a client. So we are actually rolling out some new features that include more statistical background information with every download from our app, because this is something that comes up a lot. But I also think you brought up an interesting question about the reliability of forecasting. And one thing I've noticed with ministries is, and people who are new to big data, is if you say something is coming from big data, it can sometimes get a bit of a halo effect, where because it's from this big new thing, oh, well, it must be scientifically proven. And you really need, as Scott said, people within the ministries and within the transportation engineering firms who have the statistical savviness to understand that it is still a sample, there is still normalization, and when you get into forecasting, there's still a lot of unreliability. So I think that, A, we'll try to provide you more and more and more and keep on telling us you need it, but B, communicating the imperfections transparently is just as important as putting this data to use.
Steve, did you want to?
Again, being number 3, it's nice to say I agree. But the key for us as a consumer product that is now licensing data to governments and businesses, our data is all anonymous. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. And so we have the trust of our consumers because if they've even read the terms of use, they know that downloading an app on their phone, they're exposing themselves in some way. But unlike Apple or anybody that's you're buying the product, we're not taking your personal data. We just know that you're a data point on your phone. But the trust is the key issue again.
Looking at the audience again, if they are, yes, go ahead, please.
Hello, my name's Andrew Ethel. My company is called Amalgam. I'm particularly focused on freight, and I just wanted to ask the panel your views around freight and the data question. For me, it feels like the owners of the data are the future of the freight system, and therefore, whether it's you guys, whether it's DHL or somebody else or FedEx, it's a really key point. So I don't really understand, and you don't need to tell me, but I don't really understand how you purchase your information and who you purchase it from. But I suspect that if you went to one of the big freight companies and said, can we have your data, they'd probably tell you no, because it's core to their success as an operation. However, getting that data right, making sure, there was an earlier session today talking about how to fill your trucks, how to fill your backloading, etc. By sharing that information among other companies. These are big issues for freight. Do you deal with those at all? Do you have any view around what the future looks like for the freight sector?
I do, actually. So, just as one example, INRIX has over 450,000 vehicles just in the U.S. that are light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles. And we're securing that data through a variety of means, but particularly the telematics service providers, the companies that put the black boxes into those systems, because the freight companies and the others want to understand driver performance, understanding where the drivers are, and other information related to the vehicle. And so in relation to the data ownership piece, those companies that are, the freight companies own that data, the telematics service providers own the data, and there's licensing, there's various levels of licensing of that data to third parties like INRIX. And so we're participating in freight licensing models where we'll analyze that information and provide to the City of London, for example. We just completed a license of freight in and around the City of London, just vehicles that are light goods vehicles and heavy goods vehicles, so the City of London could understand how trucks are moving in and out of the city, what roads they're taking, at which times of day, and they can implement new policies to manage their overall congestion and other efforts.
I'm going to plunge in here. This is not our area because Move It is a transit app, and we deal with urban transit only and not freight. But I'm going to make a comment that I don't think is going to be unknown to anybody here, but just to reiterate, I think the biggest responsibility for freight companies right now is to be looking 10 years into the future. What's going to happen to all the drivers who are not going to be working because of autonomous vehicles? This is something that I think we're going to have a huge workforce of people that won't have a purpose, and we need to be finding something that we can retrain them, reprogram, give them something to look forward to for sustenance, because autonomous vehicles are going to change this infrastructure pretty dramatically.
Indeed. I think ITF released a paper on that this morning that we can all download. So one small point, I agree, and we use INRIX's commercial vehicle data. It's an excellent product. We build really interesting analytics on it. But there are two new things going on in commercial truck data that I think are interesting. The first, one of the biggest requests we collectively get from cities is to understand this new, what I'll call last mile freight data. So these micro deliveries, the Amazon trucks, and what's increasingly moving into personal drivers using their vehicles during part of the day as essentially freight modes. So now you don't just have commercial trucks that are part of the freight system, you have a personal sedan that might be a personal car in the morning, a taxi during rush hour, and then a last mile freight delivery vehicle in the afternoon. And that's a very new type of data to collect on top of being a new thing that happens in the city. And the next point I want to make is that even if, say, DHL had reasonable questions about sharing the data, the truck driver now always has a phone in their pocket. And we're seeing the ability to pick up modal data about commercial driving from the drivers as opposed to the vehicles. So there's always a new angle to get at some of these questions, which can help unlock, I think, some of the hesitations.
Yes, final question from the audience. Can we get him a mic?
Hi there, Philippe Christ with the International Transport Forum. There was a study released this morning, so it's
I apologize for being behind.
No, it's. But I have a question about trust, and we talk a lot about trust, and there's an assumption even in the title here that deals with trust. It's a two-part question. How much can we trust anonymization techniques that are being put into place by different companies, yours included? Because if we know the ability for geolocalization to situate individuals at different times in different places, we would know that at least in this room there are 300 or 60 people who could be identified by their presence in this room and 4 on stage. So what is the level of trust that we can give the public and governments about the robustness of your anonymization techniques? And the second thing is, I feel we're missing a bit of the point when we always come back to data sharing, or the principle of sharing data, because really we're not looking at accessing data from the public perspective. We're looking at accessing trustable insights from that data. And so we know that there are changes in data science going forward that might change the way in which those trustable insights can be extracted from data without actually having to share the data outside of commercial entities or outside of governments. So can you give us some sense of looking forward how data science itself will change and how that might change the focus on data sharing versus data knowledge, database knowledge?
All right, and when answering this question, also use it as an opportunity for concluding remarks as we're about to wrap up the session. Go ahead, Scott.
I'll speak to the data sharing concept. You're absolutely right. And relative to the data itself, and when people talk about open data, some agencies and consumers think suddenly all the data that's being collected is going to be available on a FTP site to download all of the data. And that's actually not true in almost 99% of the cases. For commercial reasons, for privacy reasons, and other kinds of things. So it's more this cooperation to provide the processed information and even insights on top of that from analytics to the public and to other agencies. So we're doing that every day now with, as we talk about open data sharing models and how agencies can comply with open data requirements, but not pay 10 or 15 times the amount that they normally would pay if they want to make pure process data available to everyone, including, say, our competitors. It's a different price than having some process data available at a much more reasonable cost and more effective for the agency as well.
Steve?
With trust comes accountability. You know, the old saying, trust and verify. And this is born out of the corporate culture. I'll just speak, wrapping up MOVE IT. We have a very strong corporate culture that's based on humility, integrity, and trust. Those are our three letters, HIT. And we ensure that everyone we work with is coming with a position of veritable trustworthiness. And we convey that to our partnerships when we're licensing our data. We let them see how we accumulate it. We let them see, we bring them in so that they can verify that what we're providing is true. So we have to have humility, integrity, and trust in all of our relationships.
Laura, for final remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Philippe, for the question. I think there is a trade-off between openness and privacy, and that's inevitable. And as my co-panelists have said, each country needs to decide what range they're willing to take, because if you have more open data, then it will be less private and there will be a risk to privacy. I also want to mention that most of what we've been talking about, we've been using the term anonymization, but we've really been talking about de-identified data. Any data that is describing an individual's movement is never anonymous, period. And so we've been talking about data that does not say Laura Schul attached to it, but you could still know it's me if you see me here and saw me in San Francisco earlier. So I think that the trade-off, it is up to each country, and I think it will be actually quite different in different countries. When I give panels in the US, we get one quick question on privacy. We don't spend the entire panel on it, and that's going to affect what happens in Germany in terms of what data is able to be used. And I think it's okay if different countries end up at different points on the gradient, and it'll be an interesting laboratory. We also frankly see it in the states of the US. Different states will have different places they're comfortable with. So I think the fundamental answer is, again, just about being transparent. There will have to be privacy risks taken, and as long as it's very clear what they are and they're openly discussed, I think they can be managed, and we see them being managed every day around the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up the session, Public-Private Cooperation for Data Sharing. I think this was a session skipping lunch over. This has been a very fruitful discussion. Thanks, obviously, in absence to our German participants, but great deal of thanks to Steve, Laura, and Scott for giving us a more broader international perspective. Thanks so much. A big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And behind me, you see what is coming up next. This is back-to-back sessions, no beat missed. So for those of you who are following the agenda, this is what will come next. This wraps it up for this session, and wishing you a productive day and forum. Thank you for your attention.